Well, good morning from Cottage Farmstead. If we haven't met before, I'm Rebecca. And this video is going to be a little bit different than some of our previous ones. It's not going to be so much a tutorial as joining me in the farmhouse kitchen as I learn some new skills. It's so easy to watch videos on YouTube and browse Pinterest and Instagram and get all sorts of great ideas and things that you'd like to try, but then you never actually make time to try them out. Learning how to render tallow to make my own body products like tallow balm has been on my list of things to learn for a couple of years now. In fact, I think this beef fat that I'm unpackaging has been in our freezer since 2022. So part of the reason I hadn't gotten around to it was we were building our house in 2022, so I didn't have my own kitchen to learn how to do this in. The other reason is I started hearing about other people's experience trying to make their own tallow balm and that they couldn't get the beefy smell out of it. So I didn't want to ruin a whole batch of tallow balm by not knowing how to render it properly. So one afternoon while I was resting and browsing some YouTube videos, the algorithm brought up a wet rendering process for tallow that had some steps for purification. So I was very intrigued. I watched a couple of videos, looked at a couple of blog posts that talked about this method, and I figured it was worth giving it at least a try. So unfortunately, I wasn't starting with leaf fat, which is the fat around the internal organs, which is usually the purest fat that you can get off of an animal. So I knew I was definitely going to be putting this purification process to the test since I did have to cut off a fair amount of beefy bits. So the theory behind this wet rendering method is adding water and salt to pull the impurities out of your beef fat and then chill it and allow the water and fat to separate, and the impurities should theoretically fall down into the salt water, leaving you with pure tallow underneath. So I loaded up the slow cooker first thing in the morning, gave it a few stirs throughout the afternoon, but this is ultimately going to be a multi-day process. I will revisit it again later in the video. So in the meantime, dinner still needs to be made. I had come across this recipe in one of our favorite cookbooks back in the winter, and I was just waiting for sugar snap peas to be in season to give it a try. And as what usually happens when I am cooking with a recipe is I modify it pretty heavily. So this recipe called for tamari, which is essentially soy sauce, and I have to avoid soy sauce. So I decided to use white wine vinegar to see if I could get a little bit of the umami taste that way. I'm also not a huge fan of cilantro or mint, so I swapped out the herbs that I used in this recipe with flavors that I preferred. Other than a few ingredient swaps, I mostly followed the recipe as far as cooking instructions went. Farmer Nathan and I really enjoy chickpeas, especially when they are toasted or fried in a pan. They're so delicious. So that was another reason that I wanted to try this recipe, as it's another way to cook chickpeas. So one of the main reasons that I really like the Simple Green Suppers cookbook is that the meals are really, truly simple in it. Most of them are one skillet or one pot meals, so there's not a ton of dishes left over. And it also takes into account the seasonality of the garden. So this recipe relies heavily on vegetables that are available in the spring, which is great when you're trying to cook with things from your garden. We also like it as it is very budget friendly. All the recipes in here are vegetarian. So if you're trying to be careful on your sources of meat and paying a premium for your meat because of it, this is a great way to supplement with some vegetarian options on your menu plan to help you save money to buy the higher quality proteins. And one tip, if you modify recipes as much as I do, is to put a post-it note right next to your recipe as you are cooking it. So if you want to replicate whatever you created in the future, you will have some notes there so that you know how you changed it. So after dinner, I pulled out my strainer and my cheesecloth in order to strain off the grizzly bits from the tallow that I had been rendering most of the day. While I could probably have rendered this a little bit longer and tried to get more fat out of the grizzly bits, I didn't want to risk adding too much of a cooked beef flavor to my tallow, so I stopped while I was ahead here. Definitely looked very brown, so I was curious to see what it looked like come the next morning after I chilled it in the fridge overnight. So the next morning I pulled it out of the fridge and it had solidified, and I cut into it to see how much of the impurities did come out of the tallow. The water was definitely murky underneath the fat that had risen to the top in the fridge. And like the instructions mentioned, I am scraping the backside that was in contact with the salt water just to make sure that I'm getting as many of the impurities out as I can. So I'm tossing it back into the slow cooker with more water and more salt, and this is the purification step, or at least the first of them, in order to continue drawing the impurities out of the tallow. Since I did not start with the highest quality leaf fat from the cow, I know that I'm gonna probably have to do this process a couple of times in order to end up with clean water at the end. So this is the next morning. I'm cutting into the tallow after the second step of purification, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how much more clear the water was underneath. Definitely a whole lot less impurities that I was working with this time, but for some reason it was really soft and crumbly. It didn't get as solid as it did the first time, so I wasn't sure if maybe I had done something wrong, but I figured I'd try at least one more purification step just to make sure. So while I was waiting on the tallow to melt down and simmer in the salt water again, I got started on another experiment in the kitchen that I had started over the weekend. So I had seen Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone make homemade Pop-Tarts, and it looked super simple. It was just pie crust and jam. So I thought I would give it a try, as I had some sourdough discard that I needed to use. So I put together the pie crust and stuck it in the fridge over the weekend. Since I was already in the kitchen messing with the tallow today, I figured it'd be a perfect time to bring out the pie crust and to roll it out and start filling them with jam. So not too long into trying to roll my pie crust out, I realized I had come across a little bit of a snag. I bake with einkorn flour as it has a lower gluten content, and when I sour it, I'm usually able to digest it without any issues. But einkorn behaves a little bit differently than conventional wheat, so I usually have to modify how much water is in a recipe. And as I was trying to roll this out, I realized that I had a pastry dough that was a little bit too dense to get as thin as I wanted to. And when I did start getting it really thin, it was super sticky. So it was sticking to the counter. And as I was assembling them, when I would try and seal them with the fork, it would stick to the counter again. So I decided to switch to sealing them on the parchment paper so I didn't have to worry about them sticking to the counter a second time. While Pop-Tarts are technically rectangular, I didn't want to waste any of my pie crust, so I made a few oblong-shaped ones and more of a hand pie shape so that I could use up every little piece of the dough that I had left over. After topping them with a bit of egg wash, I popped them into the oven for 15 minutes, which was on the low side of what the recipe called for. And that turned out actually to be too long. They ended up being a little bit on the crispy side. Still delicious, still edible, but maybe a little bit overly brown for what I was going for. I also had a few of them leak on me, which I'm not super surprised about, as I was having a hard time getting the dough to seal with the fork as it kept sticking to my fork. But it didn't affect the taste at all. After they finished fully cooling down, I made a simple icing using powdered sugar and milk to top them with. While not being Instagram or Pinterest picture perfect, they still turned out delicious, and we have been enjoying them for several days now. And it is the next day from when I first started filming this video, and I had popped tallow from the day before into the refrigerator to let it separate and solidify. And this time around, it surprisingly was solid again. And the water underneath was even more clear. So I decided, since it didn't smell overly beefy, it still had a little bit of a beef roast smell to it, but it wasn't too bad, that I was gonna let this be good enough for my first attempt. The last step of this wet rendering process for tallow is to get the last little bit of water out of the tallow. So this time I'm going to put it onto the stove top and melt the tallow down and bring it to a simmer. So hot oil does not boil like water does. So when you're simmering, you're actually letting the water evaporate out, and when the water is totally out, it will no longer have any bubbles in it. So once I stopped hearing the crackle of water escaping the tallow, I poured it right into a mason jar to allow it to cool down. So my ultimate goal in rendering and purifying the tallow was in order to make my own tallow balm. Since it still had a little bit of a beefy aroma, I decided to see if some essential oils could mask the scent enough to be able to use it as a good body lotion. So I'll link to the recipe that I used below, but for making this tallow balm, it was a cup of the rendered purified tallow, 1/4 cup olive oil, and 48 drops of essential oils. So at that point, you could technically jar up your tallow balm at that point and let it solidify at room temperature. But the instructions said that if you wanted some whipped body butter, to pop it in the fridge until it's mostly solid and then to beat it up with your mixer until it's into a nice whipped consistency. The only downside to the whipped version is that it doesn't last quite as long, as you're mixing a lot of air into it, so it can go rancid a little bit faster, but I'm planning on using this every day, so I wasn't too concerned about it going rancid before I finish using it up. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with my first attempt at making my own tallow balm. I definitely will be trying this process again in the future, especially if I'm able to get my hands on some leaf tallow, which comes from the kidney organ area of the cow that won't have as much beef on it to start with. And hopefully that will lend itself to being less smelly and require less purification. Well, I hope you enjoyed joining me in the farmhouse kitchen this week as I learn a few new skills. And with that, I'll catch you next time.